that. I mean, here are the findings. You can't argue against it. But there are people saying, well, since they started putting more flights into that airport, it's getting noisier living around here. And the airport would probably counteract with, well, it's not as busy as it used to be in the 60s and we're doing everything right. More on this story after 7 o'clock this morning. Our man Thomas McGill reporting from the airport. Weather on BBC Essex from Zara Thornton. Cleared for takeoff. It's Southend Airport in the next hour here on BBC Essex.
Essex and proud.
A new report by Southend Airport is showing that it's complied with a number of measures that were put in place to minimise its impact on the local community. The conditions were introduced by Southend and Rochford councils when planning permission for an extended runway was granted. More details from BBC Essex's Faye Hackwell.
The report details how the airport's met targets in areas including reducing night flights, limiting noise and using certain flight paths between March 2012 and February 2013. Despite local residents making more than 1,000 claims for compensation because of noise, the airport says none of its aircraft have been found to have operated outside the legal limits. The report will be discussed by the London Southend Airport Monitoring Working Party later today.
And much more reaction to this story coming up here on the Ray Clark Breakfast Show.
The Ray Clark Breakfast Show.
Good morning, thank you for tuning in. It is the Ray Clark Breakfast Show. To many who live under the flight path of Southend have noticed an increase in aircraft noise and the frequency of those aircraft. But a report released today shows Southend Airport has complied with restrictions, minimising its impact on the local community. Well, more on that story in just a moment as we cross to Southend. We'll be looking at Wimbledon and back to Corriton as well, all in this hour.
The Ray Clark Breakfast Show.
This is BBC Essex.
Let's cross to Southend for our first story. A new report shows the noise levels generated by flights at Southend Airport has barely changed over the past 5 years. This despite more than 1,000 claims for compensation being made over the issue. Southend Airport has today published its first annual report, which shows that it's meeting the environmental restrictions that local councils have imposed since the airport expanded, and that includes noise. For BBC Essex, in Southend this morning, we go to Thomas McGill, who's close to the airport flight path. Thomas.
Indeed I am, yes. A very good morning, Ray. I'm at the home of a resident who lives very close, as you mentioned, to the airport, actually. Just at the top of her drive, I can look up right to the top of her road and see the fence of the terminal. The street is Rochforth Drive. It's directly under the flight path. And in fact, if we'd have spoke just a few minutes ago, just a tad before 7 o'clock there, you would have heard one of the first flights of this morning taken off. Now, John Fuller has been campaigning for some time against the expansion of the airport, set up Stop Airport, Southend Airport Expansion and Noise Group, and joins me now. John, very good morning. How bad is it then for residents living in this area, according to you?
It's a huge problem, really massive problem. Night flights in particular, people see as being cruel and inhuman. It really is an absolute disaster, not just for the people here in Rochford, but also for the people under the flight path in Leigh-on-Sea at the other end of the runway. Very, very densely populated area. There's far more housing around this airport than virtually any other airport in the UK. Absolutely the wrong place to put a very busy airport.
In saying that, however, there has been an independent aviation report carried out looking at the damage, if you like, that the new increased number of flights has taken. They said there's been no change between 2008 and 2012.
Well, now, that precise data, we're talking about decibels, the decibel count on any particular individual aircraft. The key point to bear in mind is that people are getting far more planes at antisocial hours coming over their houses. And this isn't just affecting the immediate community. It's getting huge numbers of complaints over at Burnham-on-Crouch and out to Canvey Island as well. This is just the wrong place for a very busy regional airport.
Well, the airport says it's investigated complaints from you and from other residents there, and that none of its aircraft have actually operated or done anything illegally. They're acting within the guidelines.
The airports obviously point out that they're operating within the parameters that the local councils have allowed to them. Lots of councils around the country have been more responsible and have banned night flights. Southend and Rochford district councils were grossly irresponsible and allowed up to 4 flights per night. flights. And this is just really an intolerable burden upon people. So the airport can make that claim that they're not breaking the law, but as far as people around here are concerned, this is just awful behaviour, really antisocial behaviour.
So are those perimeters then that have been set too low in your opinion?
Absolutely. There should be no night flights at all. No, not round any regional airport at all. Not just here in Southend. This is just an intolerable burden upon people. But also, it is the wrong place to build a very busy regional airport, because there's so much housing that's over the last few decades that's been built round this airport on the basis that it was just going to be for clubs and a bit of engineering. To suddenly make a big change and impose such a big change upon such a densely populated area, this is irresponsible planning by councils.
But given the growth that we've seen at the airport already and the plans for the future, that's not going to happen. They're not going to change the flights.
Well, we seriously wonder whether this is a viable business. There must be a very real possibility that EasyJet will return to Stansted at some point once the situation at Stansted is resolved. Maybe then Stobart may lose many millions of pounds and the airport will return to its former position, its former state. It's a very, very dubious business.
But what are you saying then? Are you expecting the airport's going to close? It's been here for decades.
It's the scale of expanded operations all over the UK. Regional airports are struggling. There are some, like for instance Manchester and Manston, that are in very real problems. So the economics of this airport probably suggest that at some point in the future, 4 or 5 years down the line, it may be forced to close. In the meantime, it imposes appalling misery upon people.
But and I'll come back to it again, it's been here for decades, in some cases long before some of the houses around here as well. So people buying these houses would have knew they're on the edge of an airport.
Well, the key point was it was a different kind of airport. If it's an airport that services a bit of engineering, quite a bit of good engineering work, a good local employer, and services the flying clubs, people were happy with that. The vast majority of people were perfectly content with that. They did not expect what they're getting now. And night flights is just an awful imposition.
And just update us on where you are with compensation, because you're fighting for that, aren't you?
Yes, we've got about 1,200 people fighting for financial compensation for loss of value of property. There are some houses that have lost tens of thousands, £60,000, £70,000 in value. There are some people in this street here who simply cannot sell. So we are trying to get them financial compensation for the huge burden that the airport has placed upon them.
And given that, of course, they've had this independent aviation noise specialist look at things, I mean, how confident are you with those compensation claims?
Very much so, because the 1973 Land Act emphasises that it is simply the question of the loss of value of property. The number of decibels isn't actually relevant. What is relevant is what that has a particular development, like an airport, done to the value of your property. And if it's dropped by £60,000-70,000, then that's the money that you're due to get.
But of course, supporters will say what's relevant is the economic benefits, the jobs, the expansion to the area, the tourism that it's going to bring to the area as well. So this is perhaps just a case of NIMBYism.
There's always that argument, but in fact the reality is very, very different. Councillors were sold this idea of tourists coming to the town, but in fact this is all one-way traffic. This is encouraging people in Essex and London to travel abroad more frequently than they would have done. In fact, we think that the airport is sucking about £185 million out of the local economy, and that's equivalent to the loss of 8,000 jobs. They've created 500 jobs there, but they're losing over 8,000 from this area.
Well, John Fuller from Stop the Airport Expansion Campaign. We'll be speaking to Alistair Welch, the MD of the airport, in the next hour.
As Thomas McGill and his guest John Fuller. Well, what do you make of that? I suppose let's just have a look at it. I mean, if it weren't an airport, it would be a huge housing estate, wouldn't it? And have we got to that point where something had to change? I don't know. I'm affected by this because I live under the flight path in Burnham, and I know a lot of people where I live are getting quite upset about it. Personally, I've lived there all my life, and I've got used to the flights. But I noticed an increase in flights last Friday and Saturday afternoon. There was enough for me to say to my neighbour, "God, there's a lot more planes coming over." But, you know, I personally haven't got a major problem with it. Others have, I guess. Tell me, 01245 49 50 50. Here's Catherine from Rochford. Hello, Catherine.
Hello, Ray.
So how close to the airport do you live then?
1.5 2.5 miles. In
Okay,
Rochford.
so you're up by the mill, that sort of area, or a bit...
No, I'm in Rochford.
Actually, Rochford proper, yeah?
The bottom end of Ashington Road, so the Rochford end of Ashington Road.
Okay, so what's your take on the increase in flights at
Well, I
Southend?
don't think that bloke lives in the same planet as me, let alone the same town, because we don't get any extra noise. We've got no problems with it at all. I mean, we've just come back last weekend, not this one before last, and we flew out to Barcelona, and a fortnight later we flew home from Venice. And it was quiet, it was simple, it was great. We were in home within half an hour. But on top of that, we just don't hear the night flights. We don't hear any of this. I think the bloke's off his trolley.
It's interesting, isn't it? Have you always lived in Rochford, Catherine?
Yeah, I've lived in this house for 31 years.
Do you remember back in the 60s it was busy, but when I was a little boy and
Yes.
you were a little girl, I guess you'd remember those noisy old planes going
but
over.
They were different. They were much more noisier planes. And then nowadays the planes are much quieter.
Do you notice a few more coming in, though?
Not really, no. I mean, I know there are. We see them, but you don't hear them.
All right, Catherine, thank you. It's Catherine from Rochford, just a few hundred yards away from John, who we heard from earlier, and two completely different opinions of the effect. If you live in Lee, if you live in Rochford, if you live in Burnham, Wallasey, Barling, are you affected by those flights? Southminster as well, they're turning over the marshes. Me and Nick Alliker, we saw about half a dozen on our bike ride the other day. Do they really, really affect you, as is the case with John? Or don't you even notice them, as is the case with Catherine? 01245 49 50 50. I'd really like to hear your story. This way, please, your thoughts. It's 16 minutes past 7. We cross to the newsroom now for BBC Essex News. Here's Nick Alliker. From BBC Essex, good morning. Thank you for tuning in. Our top story this morning, looking at Southend Airport. A new report out today shows that the airport has met the strict conditions set down to minimise disruption to the local community. This despite local residents making more than 1,000 claims for compensation over alleged noise problems. Now, the report's been compiled by the airport itself and also details how the airport has created more than 500 jobs over the past 2 years. 92% of people working in these jobs live in Essex. Well, joining us now is Nigel Holdcroft, the Conservative leader of Southend Borough Council, and Terry Cutmore, the Conservative leader of Rochford District Council. Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning, Ray.
Well, feel free to chip in, either of you, with the answers to these questions. But I will aim the first one, perhaps, at Terry. One end of the runway in Rochford, the other end, I suppose, in Southend. Tell us about the requirements that the airport has to comply with.
Well, they have to make sure that they put more of their flights over the area that's less populated. Now, because of the topography of the airport, etc., I think that's a very good thing. Perhaps not so good if you live on the Rochford side, but having said that, of course, there's a lot less people that live on the Rochford side of that, and the jet wash will go over the much less populated areas and mostly open fields. And I accept that's something. If you actually looked at the thing in the round, that's the right thing to do. And of course, the figures show that that's actually happening.
Well, is there much of a less populated area in the whole of South Essex? We heard from John Fuller earlier from the Stop Airport Expansion and Noise. He lives in the flight path and says your authorities, both you, Nigel, and you, Terry, haven't done enough to reduce the impact of flights on local residents. Have a listen to just a brief bit of what he had to say.
The airports obviously point out that they're operating within the parameters that the local councils have allowed to them. Lots of councils around the country have been more responsible and have banned night flights. Southend and Rochford district councils were grossly irresponsible and allowed up to 4 flights per night. And this is just really an intolerable burden upon people. So the airport can make that claim that they're not breaking the law, but as far as people around here are concerned, this is just awful behaviour, really antisocial behaviour.
Nigel, for Southend, have you and Rochford been too easy on the airport?
No, I don't agree, and I think, frankly, John Fuller's been completely unrealistic. We have to bear in mind that the airport has been operational for many years, and a lot of the people who now live under the flight path, in fact I suspect all of them, have moved into their current locations knowing that the airport was there. And if we go back 20 or 30 years, Southend was the third busiest airport in the country, and people who lived in the area were fully aware of and accepted that there was some disturbance, but they were prepared to accept that because of the economic benefits that the airport brought with it. when we were negotiating the latest package of environmental controls, we were not starting with a blank sheet of paper. We had a lease which meant that night flights were effectively completely unrestricted. We also had some users on the airport, particularly some aircraft maintenance users who are bringing employment, they're bringing apprenticeships, they're bringing money into the area, who could not continue to operate if there had been no night flights. So what we did was we brought down the restriction very dramatically. And I think when one looks at the environmental controls, one's got to look at where we were when the negotiations started. We didn't have the option to do anything, but what we have created is about the tightest package of controls applying to any airport across the country.
I just agree with Nigel.
Yeah, go on, Terry.
I think if you actually look at the figures that come through, it's about 4 night flights a night, but those night flights that do come in, they do have restrictions on the noise that they can produce for a start, which of course weren't there before, and of course only 16% of that quota has ever been used over the last period, and that comes out in the figures as well. So indeed I think as far as the sort of gain, if you like, for residents from the controls that we put on, I think that's a positive, not a negative, and I think it's extremely unfair to try and put that forward as a negative for residents.
But despite those restrictions, and Nigel suggesting that John was being unreasonable there, it's not just John, it's more than 1,000 people who were seeking compensation because of noise disruption, and these voices weren't heard at all 3-4 years ago, so something's changed, and a lot of people, 1,000 at least, are upset about it.
Well, I mean, firstly, I think that residents had got used to the fact that over a number of years the airport had been operating at very low levels. Those of us with longer memories can remember that actually the disruption that the older and more noisy aircraft were creating 30, 40 years ago was far worse than we have now. So we are sympathetic to the fact that obviously when there is greater aircraft numbers of flights over properties, it will have an effect on residents, and that is the reason why we were so careful to create the tightest package of environmental controls that we could. So far as the claims, well, obviously there is a process in place where people can submit claims if they feel the values of their property has been affected. It's going to be interesting to see what the outcome of those claims are.
Terry, there are plans in place, and we'll find out again when we speak to the airport a little later, for expansion to a point. But when you get to that point in the next few years, I believe it's 2020 from memory, would you want to see the airport any bigger than it is now?
I think that's a conversation that we have to have. I think there's a balance between the benefits that the airport brings to the community as far as jobs creation is concerned, and of course the environmental impact of that airport, and of course there's finite limitations on that. Again, I think that's a conversation to be had. We're not there yet. Of course, we're looking at something that's happening now. May I just say, I used to actually live in Dalberton Avenue off Bridgewater Drive when I was about 9 years old, and I was directly under the flight path of the aircraft then. We used to have all these Carviers go over, and they were great big lumbering planes that used to take an age to get over, engines screaming. Don't get that now with the modern jets that we have there. They're over and they're gone. But when you used to get a jet, my God, you used to know about it. I think recently there was a jet that flew over the west of Essex, and I think people in the which was a military jet, which is a similar sound to the old jets there used to be. And I think most of Essex complained about that at the time.
Is that a valid argument, though, really, Terry, or Nigel, for that matter? I mean, we used to have smoky atmosphere, but times change. Should people still have to put up with what they see as the inconvenience of loud jet noise?
Well, I think it's the reality. We all want to fly an aircraft, and frankly, they have to fly somewhere. Also, if you look at the airport, I mean, we have had a private investment here of £100 million. It's creating employment. It's a great economic benefit to the town, and I think if you look at it overall, and certainly the impression I'm getting is that the vast majority of Southend residents, even those who are affected by greater noise levels, are very supportive of what's going on at the airport.
I agree with Nigel on that one very much. I must say that if you actually look at the figures, it's the people who live in this part of Essex, and certainly this this area of the south of Essex that are actually using the airport and taking the advantage of it. And the message I'm getting back from people that I know is, fantastic to have something like that on your doorstep that you can use.
All right, both of you, thank you. Nigel Holdcroft, the Conservative leader of Southend Borough Council, Terry Cutmore, the Conservative leader of Rochford District Council, and later, our man Thomas at Southend Airport. He'll be speaking to the Managing Director and meeting more local people who've got jobs at Southend. But as we've said, not everybody's happy. We heard from John Fuller earlier. He lives in Rochford. This noise is disrupting. I don't want it. I'm really annoyed with what's going on. Yet we heard from Catherine, who also lives in Rochford, saying no problem. So what about you? Are you affected by the noise from Southend Airport? You might live in, we're looking at Rochford and Southend here, but the Malden district, in Burnham. A lot of people have been quite vociferous about airport noise. Others, again, saying not particularly a problem. How does it affect you if you live in that corner of South East Essex? 01245 49 50 50. 01245 49 50 50. I'd like to hear your voice. 14 minutes to 8. Nick Alliker joins us here on BBC Essex from the newsroom and this morning's top news stories.
Good morning. Southend Airport bosses say they're meeting their targets to minimise disruption to local communities.
And your comments, please. Have you noticed the increase in the noise in and out of Southend Airport, or doesn't it affect you? Mainly dry today, sunny period. Morning. It is the Ray Clark Breakfast Show here on BBC Essex. More about Southend Airport in the next hour. Our man Thomas McGill is there, but with plenty of calls coming in as to whether or not you're affected by the noise from Southend. Well, that's my question. Are you? We've heard two people in Rochford. One says, big problem, don't like it. The other one saying, what's the problem here? I don't hear the flights. And is that the way it is? Not just in Southend, not just in Rochford, but in Lee perhaps, or further up the coast, over to Burnham, Southminster, that sort of area. Let's have a chat with Pauline. Hi, Pauline.
Hi.
Hiya, where are you?
I'm in Westcliff, Somerton Avenue, where the planes come right down the middle of the road.
Well, not quite, but yeah, over the top of you.
They seem to down there. And they are so low that, they took our beech tree down and they lowered the lamppost, so that gives you a clue.
Yeah,
they are.
And I mean, you're aware of them, but is it the noise? Do you stop what you're doing and look up at them when they go over?
Well, you have to, because if you're talking on the phone, you can't hear what the other person's saying, and they can't hear you. If you're in the middle of a good programme, you could lose the plot, because it just drowns out the television. So, yes, you are very aware of them.
Have you noticed it getting worse in the last year?
Yeah. If it stays like it is, you can live with it, but I hate to think if it, starts getting really, really busy. And on my fish pond, I've got this layer of oil, so I'm sure that comes from the plane as it takes off.
Really? Well, that's quite interesting and perhaps worrying if that were the case. We'll ask Thomas to ask the man from the airport about that, because that is a bit concerning. OK, thank you, Pauline. There's Pauline in Westcliff, not so keen on the airport. Let's go to Rosemary in Rochford, the other end of the runway. Hello, Rosemary.
Hello. No, I've lived in Rochford for many years, so I remember the old car fares, and we've always lived really within the flight path. I like the airport, I use it, and these planes are so much quieter. The airport's been here since about 1909, so it's always been here.
Is that an argument we can use, though, nowadays? Because
Well, I think so, because I know things have got to progress, and yes, we want quieter this and quieter that. We all like to fly, we all like to go somewhere, and we all like it on our doorstep.
OK, thank you very much. See, two opposing views. More, please. 01245 49 50 50, my telephone number. You watch Wimbledon often, it seems, are the facts. But there are two sides to every story. We've been hearing from people this morning saying, I'm really, really affected by aircraft noise out of Southend Airport. Others saying, what's the problem? A report released today shows that the airport has, as I said, complied with those restrictions, minimising its impact on the local community. Despite local residents making more than 1,000 claims for compensation because of noise, the airport says none of its aircraft have been found to have operated outside the legal limits. John Fuller lives in the airport's flight path. He's from the Stop Airport Expansion and Noise campaign group. He's accused the local authorities of being too soft on Southend Airport in allowing night flights.
The airport's obviously point out that they're operating within the parameters that the local councils have allowed to them. Lots of councils around the country have been more responsible and have banned night flights. Southend and Rochford district councils were grossly irresponsible and allowed up to 4 flights per night. And this is just really an intolerable burden upon people. So the airport can make that claim that they're not breaking the law, but as far as people around here are concerned, this is just awful behaviour, really antisocial behaviour.
John Fuller went on to say that he believes that Southend Airport could even close in the next few years.
We seriously wonder whether this is a viable business. There must be a very real possibility that EasyJet will return to Stansted at some point once the situation at Stansted is resolved. Maybe then Stobart's may lose many millions of pounds and the airport will return to its former position, its former state. It's a very, very dubious business.
But what are you saying then? Are you expecting the airport is going to close? It's been here for decades.
It's the scale of expanded operations all over the UK. Regional airports are struggling. There are some, like for instance Manchester and Manston, that are in very real problems. So the economics of this airport probably suggest that at some point in the future, 4 or 5 years down the line, it may be forced to close. In the meantime, it imposes appalling misery upon people.
The views of John Fuller. These listeners who also live in the flight path have called BBC Essex this morning to air their views.
If you're talking on the phone, you can't hear what the other person's saying and they can't hear you. If you're in the middle of a good programme, you could lose a plot because it just drowns out the television. So, yes, you are very aware of them.
Have you noticed it getting worse in the last year?
Yeah. If it stays like it is, you can live with it, but I hate to think if it, starts getting really, really busy. And on my fish pond, I've got this layer of oil, so I'm sure that comes from the plane as it takes off.
I've lived in Rochford for many years, so I remember the old Carvairs, and we've always lived really within the flight path. I like the airport, I use it, and these planes are so much quieter. The airport's been here since about 1909, so it's always been here.
Is that an argument we can use, though, nowadays? Because
Well, I think so, because I know things have got to progress, and yes, we want quieter this and quieter that. We all like to fly, we all like to go somewhere, and we all like it on our doorstep.
Opposing views from Southend, and we were hearing from both ends of the runway. One end in Southend, one end in Rochford, effectively, Lee and Rochford. But as I mentioned, where I live, I'm hearing people in Burnham and Southminster saying, "Wow, have you noticed the noise of those aeroplanes?" Well, to be honest, no, say some people. Again, there's that, oh, what a problem. No, it's not a problem. And I'd be interested to hear your view if you live on that flight path, in particular to the north of the River Crouch. Are you affected? Or are you another of those? Just as, well, don't really notice it. Let's go to Thomas McGill, who's actually at the airport. Thomas.
I am indeed, yes. Good morning, Ray. We're just standing outside the main terminal area and next to or near the train station as well. A new train station built to accommodate the thousands of passengers anticipated to come through these doors in the coming years. And lots to get through there. I'm standing beside the managing director of the airport, Alistair Welch. And Alistair, you haven't heard many of those comments from local residents there, but I will come to those in a few minutes' time. But first of all, I must ask you, are you satisfied with the findings of this report?
Well, I think when we set out on the redevelopment of the airport, we were very clear that we wanted to make sure that we put in place a whole lot of safeguards to ensure that people knew how many flights there might be and to understand the controls that would be in place in future at night. And what the report does very clearly is set out that not only have those controls been complied with, but that actually the airport is making sure that we are doing, I think, responsibly what we should be doing with regards to supporting the local community.
Well, we heard from John Fuller, who helps organise Stop Airport Expansion and Noise, and he says that basically the report, it's easy to meet those targets because they've been set by the council very low.
Well, that's interesting. I think it's fair to say that in the 1980s we had over 100,000 movements, that's aeroplane flights every year. The cap going forwards is less than half of the number of movements we had in the 80s. At night, in the 80s, we had more than 50 flights every night on average. That's now been capped at fewer than 4 movements an average at night. And there are so many other controls in place which are really challenging for us. And one, for example, is that if any aircraft over a certain weight deviates from what's called a noise preferential route, a route they must fly, we have to capture that, identify that, go through that with the operator of the aeroplane and report on that. And we've done that with every single case over the last year.
OK, well, let's turn to noise there. You mentioned it. The number of flights has increased dramatically since Stobarts has taken the place over. Some local residents, not all, are upset by that. They've said their property price, the price of their property has been blighted, and that they're not happy about that. What do you say to them people?
Well, I think there's two things. One is that we have always said that what the extended runway would bring is it would mean that allow that more modern aircraft could operate from the airport, and those aircraft are both larger and much quieter than the aircraft we've had in the past. And so the aircraft we have now are significantly quieter and larger, and it means that people locally can fly to places they frankly want to fly to rather than going to Gatwick or Stansted instead. So we're really pleased with that. And in terms of the impact on local properties, you're right, there are some people who have put in claims for compensation. If people believe their properties have been devalued as a direct result of the runway, they're entitled to get compensation, absolutely fine. And what then happens is a process whereby an assessment is made as to whether property prices actually have gone down or gone up. It's far too soon for me to say whether they have gone down or gone up, but I have to say that the information we're getting so far and what I'm reading in the press suggests actually the new jobs we have in the area and people coming to the area may be having the opposite effect. But time will tell.
Well, you mentioned jobs there, and of course 500 jobs were created when the airport expansion took place. Two people who benefited from that expansion are with me now as well. Stuart Holliday and Hannah Lebeau are both here and work at the airport. Hannah, if I could speak to you first of all. So what do you do at the airport?
So I look after the business.
Right, we can rejoin, hopefully, Thomas, in just a moment or two here on BBC Essex, live from Southend Airport, 14 minutes past 8 now. Thomas, you're back with us.
5 minutes around the corner. But yeah, I moved from Lisbon.
I am indeed. Sorry, Ray. Yes, I'm with Hannah Lebeau, who's just telling us basically what she does at the airport. And Hannah, how have you seen things change then in your short time here?
There's always changes going on here, which is really refreshing to see. I think with regards to the changes, there's lots of, because it's such a small community working here, we really muck in and help each other. So you see the process very quickly.
And Stuart, for you, again, working at the airport, how difficult was it to get a job locally prior to the airport coming to Stansted, or to Southend?
Before I started here, I was working in London. I was working for the BBC, for the World Service. Unfortunately, I was made redundant. I was looking around for another position, and luckily it was at the time where the airport were looking for staff. So I struck lucky, I suppose, and got the right time. And for me, I live in Wickford, so it's just 20 minutes down the road. So it has made a lot of differences to my life in both travel and in quality of my work. So,
and of course there's more expansion underway at the minute. We can see there's the hoarding around a bit of an expansion to the other end of the airport as well. Do you welcome that?
Absolutely. It can only mean more passengers, more space for our passengers, a better environment, and going forward, ultimately, there will be additional members of staff needed.
And just finally then, Alistair, if I could turn to you as well, another comment from John Fuller. He suggested that once EasyJet sort out their problems at Stansted, they may revert back there, and all this investment may be for nothing, that the airport may close.
So I guess if that really was the case, then what's he worrying about? But from our point of view, our aim is to make sure that people have a great experience here. Never more than 4 minutes to go through security as you go out, 15 minutes back to your car with hand luggage as you come in, and people really appreciate the difference. We should go have our millionth passenger going through the airport very shortly. We think it's a huge success story, huge local employment, and we're really proud of what we've done locally.
And very quickly on the expansion, where are you at? What's the future?
Well, we have, in the last week, we have a new aircraft that's come based here, and that now means we're serving Berlin, Krakow and Newquay, as well as our other destinations, which are going very well. The extension of the terminal, the arrivals bay has opened, so that's now in use. So passengers using the airport, when they arrive, will see a far bigger immigration hall and far bigger baggage hall now, and that's really good. And then going forwards throughout the year, we'll be opening a bigger security area, a bigger check-in area, and then a bigger departure lounge by Christmas.
Alistair Welch there from Southend Airport, and as you've been hearing then, Ray, it's onwards and upwards with expansion here at the airport. Next flight due, I think, to leave here in about half an hour.